Premier, when it comes to crude oil, if you go bigger, you're looking at Canadian exports to the U.S. 60% of America's total oil imports come from Canada. So do you want to go bigger in this, if these tariffs are going to go through?
The United States relies on Canada for nearly half of its natural gas imports. But what if Canada decided to shut the tap on America's energy needs? It sounds like a doomsday scenario, but with shifting geopolitics, environmental policies, and economic disputes, it's a very real possibility. In this video, we'll explore why Canada might turn off the gas, how it could cripple the U.S. energy sector, and what America can do to prevent an energy crisis.
I want to sell more electricity, more power to our U.S. friends and closest allies in the world. But that's a tool that we have in our toolbox. We power over 1.5 million homes in Michigan and companies in Michigan and New York State and Wisconsin. That's the last thing I want to do. I want to sell more energy to the U.S. I want to sell more critical minerals to the U.S. Again, we're the closest trading partner, closest allies. We do $1.3 trillion of two-way trade. That's more than Japan, China, UK, and France combined.
First, let's talk numbers. Canada supplies about 50% of all U.S. natural gas imports, making it the single largest supplier of foreign gas to the United States. That gas flows through major pipelines like TC Energy's NGTL system and Enbridge's Mainline, heading to key U.S. markets in the Midwest, Northeast, and even the Pacific Northwest. Canada is the largest source of U.S. energy imports and the second largest destination for U.S. energy exports behind only Mexico. Energy is an important component of trade between Canada and the United States. In 2019, based on the latest annual Standard International Trade Classification (SITC) data from the U.S. Census Bureau, energy accounted for $85 billion or 27% of the value of all U.S. imports from Canada. Crude oil and petroleum products accounted for 91% of the value of U.S. energy imports from Canada and 89% of the value of U.S. energy exports to Canada. The United States exported $23 billion of crude oil, petroleum products, natural gas, and electricity to Canada in 2019, about 8% of the value of all U.S. exports to Canada, and the second highest level recorded after peaking in 2014. Natural gas trade between the United States and Canada is dominated by pipeline shipments, which accounted for 98% of all U.S. natural gas imports in 2019. Historically, the United States has imported more natural gas than it has exported by pipeline to Canada. Natural gas imports from Canada in 2019 totaled 7.4 billion cubic feet per day and were valued at $6 billion in 2019. Most of the natural gas the United States imported from Canada originated in Western Canada and was shipped to U.S. markets in the West and Midwest regions. U.S. natural gas exports to Canada mainly go into the eastern provinces of Canada. Electricity accounts for a small but locally important share of U.S.-Canada energy trade. The electricity systems of both countries are fully interconnected markets, and they share more than 30 major cross-border electric transmission lines, which also supports electric system reliability. In 2019, the United States imported 52 million megawatt-hours of electricity from Canada and exported 14 million megawatt-hours to Canada. The Pacific Northwest is a primary source of electricity exports to Canada, and most electricity imported into the United States from Canada goes to states in the Northeast.
4.3 million barrels every single day. If there was a tariff on that, that would increase gas by $1 a gallon. That wouldn't go over very well. And, both sides of the border are going to feel the pain.
But imagine this. What if Canada suddenly pulled the plug? This way, the United States would suddenly lose over 8 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. That's enough to power millions of homes and businesses. And with American domestic production already stretched to meet demand, this would be a catastrophe. But the question that still remains is, why would Canada ever stop sending gas to its biggest customer? Well, here are the three main reasons that analysts and experts have found out. Number 1. Environmental policies and climate goals. Canada has aggressive climate policies, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government has made it clear reducing carbon emissions is a top priority. There's already been talk of phasing out fossil fuels, restricting new pipeline projects, and enforcing tougher regulations on natural gas production. If these policies go further, Canada might prioritize domestic clean energy over gas exports, choking the supply to the U.S.
The Supreme Court ruling puts the debate as to whether or not we should act and whether or not the federal government can act on climate change behind us. So now let's work together, all of us. There's a couple of provinces that have their own system, which is totally possible under the federal scheme that was put forward in 2016. Quebec has its own system. British Columbia has its own system.
In 2018, Canada enacted the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, establishing minimum national standards for carbon pricing in provinces and territories across the country. The federal government put two systems in place, one for large industrial polluters and one for Canadian consumers. The consumer carbon price, which is what has drawn the most scrutiny and political wire, placed levies on everyday purchases of fossil fuel products such as diesel, petrol, and natural gas. These levies have increased over time. The latest hike in April meant that the policy now costs 12 US cents more per liter of petrol, or 17.6 cents in Canadian dollars, according to the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The thinking is that by increasing the cost of fossil fuels, Canadian consumers will be forced to change their behavior and move away from products that increase greenhouse gas emissions. The scheme is just one part of the Liberal government's overall strategy to tackle climate change. You're making everybody pay a little bit all the time, and so it's a highly visible policy, Mertens Kirkwood said. He noted that Canadians feel the effects of carbon pricing every time they fill up their gas tanks, pay their natural gas bill, or go to the grocery store.
The U.S. should also adopt carbon pricing to make their companies more competitive in a more and more climate-constrained world.
Okay, a last question politically. I mean, obviously the legal battle's over. The highest court of the land has spoken, and there are no further legal avenues. But there is a political battle, and for those recalcitrant, those reluctant provinces who took you to court, some of them are still saying that this is an era of Big Brother government.
For years, Pierre Poilievre has hammered home a simple slogan: axe the tax. The leader of Canada's opposition Conservative Party, who is widely expected to become Prime Minister this year, has vowed to repeal a carbon pricing scheme enacted by outgoing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Liberal government. The policy put an added cost on fossil fuel products such as petrol as part of the country's push to reduce emissions and tackle the climate crisis. Dubbing it a carbon tax, Poilievre has blamed the environmental program for an affordability crisis in Canada, despite research that shows carbon pricing has had a negligible effect on inflation. He has also pledged to axe the tax for everyone forever.
You know what the leader of the opposition is proposing to cut for Canadians? The carbon rebate, Mr. Speaker.
60% of Canadians are paying more in his carbon tax than they get back in rebates. And now we learn that 40% of Nova Scotia households are struggling to pay their electricity bills. The carbon tax, of course, applies on the share of electricity that is generated through traditional hydrocarbons and other fossil fuels, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is going to hit Canadians with yet another tax hike on April the 1st. Will he, if he can't summon the common sense to axe the tax, will he at least cap the tax so Canadians can afford to eat?
We need a carbon tax election to fire them all and bring home a common-sense Conservative government, he said in a recent video posted on social media, referring to the Liberals. The Conservatives are hoping that their anti-carbon tax strategy will pay off an upcoming federal vote, as Canadians continue to struggle with high grocery and housing costs. Experts say the Tories' campaign has made carbon pricing a hard sell politically, with even the frontrunners in the race to replace Trudeau as head of the ruling Liberal Party backing away from the policy. The Conservatives in particular have made a lot of political hay from fighting back on carbon pricing. Axe the tax is now the central pillar of the federal Conservative campaign strategy, said Hadrian Mertens Kirkwood, a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. There's certainly some political opportunism happening here. The The Conservatives see this as a winning issue, and so they double and triple down and have turned it into a controversial position. Yet Mertens Kirkwood said the political rhetoric around carbon pricing has dramatically overblown the issue, both in terms of its effects on affordability and its importance in the overall climate fight. Number 2, trade disputes and political tensions.
So we'll be announcing the tariffs on Canada and Mexico for a number of reasons. Number one is the people that have poured into our country so horribly and so much. Number two are the drugs, fentanyl, and everything else that have come into the country. And number three are the massive subsidies that we're giving to Canada and to Mexico in the form of deficits. And I'll be putting the tariff of 25% on Canada and separately 25% on Mexico. And we will really have to do that because we have very big deficits with those countries. Those tariffs may or may not rise with time.
Will oil be part of that, though? Because we get oil from Canada.
Oil is going to have nothing to do with it as far as I'm concerned. Oil has nothing to do with it.
The U.S. and Canada have had trade tensions before: softwood lumber, dairy, even auto manufacturing. What if an energy dispute sparks between Washington and Ottawa? If Canada sees the U.S. imposing tariffs or restricting Canadian energy projects, they could retaliate by limiting gas exports. We've seen this before. In 2018, Canada slapped tariffs on U.S. goods in response to Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs. Energy could be next. Number 3, a push for energy independence.
LNG plants in Canada. The Liberals have forced Canadians to sell almost all of our energy to the United States, giving President Trump massive leverage in making these tariff threats. Had they allowed the Energy East and Northern Gateway pipelines to go ahead, had they rapidly approved LNG plants to sell the natural gas that Japan, Greece, Germany, and other countries were looking for us to sell them directly.
Canada has been ramping up efforts to develop its own liquefied natural gas (LNG) industry. With massive LNG projects on the West Coast like LNG Canada, there's a growing incentive to export gas to Asia instead of the U.S. Cutting U.S. exports could help Canada keep more gas at home or send it to higher-paying international markets. Now, let's talk about the disastrous consequences for the U.S. energy sector. 1. Energy prices would skyrocket. With 50% of imported natural gas gone, the U.S. would face an immediate supply shock. Gas prices could double or even triple in a matter of weeks. That means higher electricity bills, more expensive heating costs, and increased industrial expenses. 2. Power grids would be at risk. Many U.S. power plants rely on natural gas for electricity generation. A sudden drop in supply could lead to rolling blackouts, especially in states like Minnesota, Illinois, and New York. 3. Industry shutdowns and job losses. Industries that depend on natural gas, like manufacturing and agriculture, would suffer. Factories could shut down, layoffs would spike, and supply chains would be disrupted. The economic impact could be catastrophic. But the real question is, could the U.S. find a way to survive without Canadian gas? Let's look at the possible solutions. 1. Increased domestic gas production. The U.S. has massive natural gas reserves, particularly in the Permian Basin, Marcellus Shale, and Haynesville Shale. But ramping up production takes time. New drilling projects face regulatory hurdles, and environmental groups are pushing back against fossil fuel expansion. 2. Import LNG, liquefied natural gas, from other countries. The U.S. could turn to LNG imports from countries like Qatar, Australia, or even Europe. But there's a catch. Importing LNG is far more expensive than pipeline gas. That means higher costs for consumers and businesses. 3. Transition to renewables faster. Long term, the best solution might be investing in renewable energy, wind, solar, and hydroelectric power. But renewables alone can't replace 9 billion cubic feet of gas overnight. The transition would take decades, not years. Now let's be clear. Canada cutting off gas exports isn't happening tomorrow. But is it a real possibility? Absolutely. If Canada prioritizes its climate policies or if trade tensions escalate, the U.S. could find itself in an energy crisis. Experts say the U.S. needs to start diversifying its energy sources now, before it's too late. So what do you think? Could Canada actually pull the plug on U.S. gas imports? And if they did, how would America survive the crisis? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more talk about the world of energy and geopolitics. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.